They walked away from each other not because love had faded, but because it burned too bright. Frank Cole and Natalie Wright moved forward on separate roads, both changed, both stronger, yet both carrying an emptiness nothing else could fill. When the ghost of St. Catherine's finally resurfaced, when the man who destroyed Natalie's childhood faced justice, they had no choice but to stand together again, not to save each other, but to answer the only question that mattered: is love about holding on or letting go, and can two broken people stay without losing themselves? This is part 3 of Frank and Natalie's story, the final chapter. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, I recommend going back to watch them first. The links are in the description below. Trust me, this ending will mean so much more when you know everything they've been through to get here. Now, let's begin. 18 months had passed since Natalie Wright walked out of Frank Cole's penthouse, and the world had continued spinning as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Frank stood on the balcony of his Manhattan apartment, watching the first light of morning spread across the skyline. The city stretched endlessly before him, towers of glass and steel reaching toward a sky painted in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere across the river, in a small Brooklyn apartment, Natalie was probably waking up too. He did not know this for certain. He had not called her, had not tracked her movements, had not sent anyone to watch over her. That was the old Frank, the man who believed love meant control, who thought protection required possession. He had buried that man alongside his need to fix everything. The glass ring foundation had grown beyond anything he had imagined. What started as a single program now supported hundreds of children aging out of the foster system, providing housing assistance, job training, and counseling services. Frank no longer ran his company as CEO. The board had pushed him out after he publicly acknowledged his orphanage past during the media scandal, and he had let them. He retained his shares, his wealth, his influence, but he no longer needed the title to know who he was. Every morning before he began his work with the foundation, Frank opened the top drawer of his desk and looked at the wooden box inside. 2 copper rings rested on velvet lining, one worn smooth by 20 years of faithful keeping, one newer and clumsier, made by hands that had forgotten how to create something without paying someone else to do it. Natalie had asked him to keep them safe until she was ready to return. He did not know when that would be. He did not know if it would ever happen. But he kept them anyway, because some promises were worth honoring even when hope grew thin. At 39 years old, Frank Cole had finally learned that patience was not the same as waiting. It was living fully while leaving space for possibility. Across the East River, Natalie woke to sunlight streaming through the window of her Brooklyn apartment. The space was small, a studio with a kitchenette, a single bed, a desk by the window where she wrote in her journal each morning. She had lived here for 18 months, now longer than she had lived anywhere since childhood. The walls held photographs she had taken herself, the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, children playing in Prospect Park, an elderly couple holding hands on a bench. Evidence of a life she was learning to call her own. She no longer worked as a housekeeper. After completing her therapy, 2 years of excavating wounds she had buried for over 2 decades, Natalie had started volunteering at a crisis center for survivors of abuse. 3 days a week, she sat with women and men who carried stories similar to hers, listening without judgment, offering presence without pity. She had discovered something unexpected in that work. Her pain, which she had always considered her greatest shame, had become her greatest gift. She understood things that others could not. She recognized the look in someone's eyes when they were about to disappear into themselves. She knew how to sit in silence with another person's darkness without trying to fix it. For the first time in 37 years, Natalie Wright felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because anyone needed her, but because she had finally learned to need herself. She still thought about Frank. Not constantly, not with the desperate ache of those first months, but steadily like a river that runs beneath the surface of everything. She wondered if he was happy. She wondered if he had moved on. She wondered if the copper rings still sat in that wooden box, or if he had put them away somewhere she would never find them. She was not ready to go back. She did not know if she ever would be, but she had stopped running, and that felt like progress. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. Natalie found it in her mailbox among the usual bills and advertisements, a crisp white envelope with no return address, only her name typed in clean black letters. She carried it upstairs, set it on her kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letterhead bore the name of a law firm she did not recognize. The contents made her hands tremble. A federal investigation had been launched into historical abuse cases at orphanages across the eastern seaboard. St. Catherine's in Baltimore was among the institutions under scrutiny. Investigators had identified a former staff member named Thomas Garrett as a primary suspect in multiple cases spanning nearly 15 years. They had testimony from several survivors. They were building a case, and they wanted to know if Natalie Wright would be willing to add her voice to the others. She read the letter 3 times. Each time the name Thomas Garrett struck her like a physical blow. 21 years had passed since that storage room. 21 years since she had learned what it meant to be powerless, to be used, to be discarded. She had spent 2 decades burying that memory so deep, she sometimes convinced herself it had happened to someone else. And now here it was, summoned back into the light by a letter from strangers who wanted her to speak. Natalie set the letter down and walked to the window. Brooklyn spread out before her, ordinary and unchanged. People walked their dogs. Cars honked at intersections. A mother pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But for Natalie, everything had just shifted. 3 days later, she learned that she was not the only one who had received a letter. The Glass Ring Foundation had been contacted by the same legal team. They needed organizational support resources, and most importantly, they needed Frank Cole. As a former resident of St. Catherine's and a prominent advocate for orphan welfare, his involvement would lend credibility to the case. His foundation could provide legal assistance to survivors who could not afford representation. His voice could help ensure that Thomas Garrett faced justice. Frank agreed immediately. He had not known about the abuse during his years at St. Catherine's. He had aged out before Garrett arrived, but he understood what the institution had been capable of hiding. He understood how easily the powerful could silence the powerless, and he understood that this case mattered more than his comfort, his privacy, or his carefully reconstructed peace. When his assistant handed him the list of potential witnesses, Frank scanned the names with professional detachment. Then he stopped. Natalie Wright. He read her name again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. But there it was, typed in the same clean font as all the others, waiting for him to acknowledge what it meant. She was going to testify. She was going to stand before a courtroom and tell the world what had happened to her in that orphanage. And if Frank participated in this case, which he had already committed to doing, they would inevitably cross paths. For 18 months, he had respected her distance. He had not reached out, not interfered, not tried to pull her back into his orbit. But now, the universe had made that choice for both of them. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at the law firm's office in Midtown Manhattan. Witnesses and supporters would gather to discuss strategy, review timelines, and prepare for the difficult road ahead. Frank arrived early, as he always did. He sat in the conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its polished mahogany table, reviewing documents he had already memorized. His mind was not on the papers. His mind was on the door. When it opened, he looked up. Natalie stood in the doorway, older than he remembered, and somehow younger at the same time. The fear that had always lived behind her eyes was gone. In its place was something he had never seen before: steadiness. She looked at him directly, without flinching, without looking away. She had changed. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the set of her shoulders, in the calm certainty of her presence. Neither of them moved to embrace. There were no tears, no dramatic declarations, Just two people who had once meant everything to each other meeting again in a room full of legal documents and fluorescent lights. "It's been a while," she said. 18 months, he replied. Natalie nodded and took a seat across the table from him. The distance between them felt both enormous and paper-thin. The lead attorney entered and began explaining the case, the evidence they had gathered, the witnesses who had agreed to testify, the challenges they would face from Garrett's defense team. Frank listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. But part of his attention remained fixed on Natalie, watching her absorb information about the man who had destroyed something precious inside her so many years ago. When the attorney mentioned that witnesses would likely face aggressive cross-examination, that their personal lives would be scrutinized, that anything could be used to discredit their testimony, Frank spoke up. "The Foundation can provide protective resources," he offered. "Legal support, security, whatever the witnesses need." Natalie's voice cut through before anyone else could respond. "I don't need protection." She looked at Frank, her gaze unwavering. "If I testify with my real name and my real face. I've spent enough of my life hiding." The room fell silent. Frank held her gaze and saw something he recognized, the same determination he had once seen in a 16-year-old girl who refused to let the world break her no matter how hard it tried. She was not the woman he had tried to save 18 months ago. She was someone new, someone who did not need saving. For the first time since she had walked out of his life, Frank Cole smiled. "Then we do this together," he said. "Not as protector and protected, just as two people who survived the same place." Natalie studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Together." The weeks that followed the meeting at the law firm became a slow unraveling of everything Natalie had spent 2 decades trying to forget. She sat in her Brooklyn apartment each night, writing and rewriting her testimony. The legal team needed details, specific dates, locations, descriptions of what had happened in the storage room at St. Catherine's when she was 15 years old. They needed her to transform the worst moments of her life into clear, factual statements that could withstand cross-examination. The first draft took her 3 days to complete. She wrote it in fragments, stopping every few paragraphs when the memories became too heavy to carry. She wrote about the way Thomas Garrett had smiled at her in the hallways, how he had singled her out for special attention, how she had mistaken his interest for kindness, because no one else at St. Catherine's had ever been kind to her. She wrote about the storage room, the smell of cleaning supplies and dust, the cold concrete floor beneath her back. She wrote about the months of silence that followed, the shame that wrapped around her like a second skin, the baby that lived for only a few hours before slipping away. When she finished, she read the document from beginning to end. It was all there, every detail she had buried, every truth she had refused to speak. Seeing it written down made it real in a way it had never been before. This was not a nightmare she could wake from. This was her history, and soon the whole world would know it. Frank received a copy of Natalie's testimony through the legal team's secure document system. They needed him to review it, they explained, because his involvement with the Foundation meant he would likely face questions about his relationship with the witnesses. He should be prepared for anything the defense might use against them. He read her words alone in his office. The door closed, the city silent beyond his windows. Each sentence struck him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood about the woman he loved. He had known something terrible had happened to her at St. Catherine's. She had told him about the baby, about the loss, about the years of buried grief. But he had never known the full story. He had never understood the depth of what she had survived. When he finished reading, Frank did not cry. He did not rage. He simply sat in the darkness of his office, feeling the weight of 21 years of silence pressing down on his chest. He understood now why she had always chosen to disappear. When your very existence had been violated, invisibility felt like the only safe place left. But she was not disappearing now. She was stepping into the light, and he would stand beside her when she did. The media discovered the connection between Frank Cole and the St. Catherine's case within days. Reporters who had covered the scandal 18 months earlier saw an opportunity for a sequel. Headlines appeared across news sites and social media platforms linking the billionaire philanthropist to the abuse investigation, questioning his motives, speculating about his relationship with one of the key witnesses. The board of the Glass Ring Foundation held an emergency meeting. Frank sat at one end of the table while a dozen faces stared at him with varying degrees of concern and calculation. Margaret Reynolds, the board chair, spoke first. "Your involvement is becoming a liability. The foundation's credibility depends on objectivity. If you're personally connected to a witness, the defense will use that to undermine the entire case." Frank listened without interrupting. He had expected this conversation. "We're recommending that you step back from public involvement," Margaret continued. "Remain a donor, retain your seat, but let someone else be the face of this effort." The old Frank would have fought. He would have reminded them that he had built this foundation with his own money, his own vision, his own hands. He would have refused to be pushed aside by people who cared more about optics than justice. But the man sitting at that table was not the old Frank. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but I'm not stepping back. I'm going to testify about my experience at St. Catherine's. I'm going to publicly acknowledge my connection to this case, and I'm going to do it because hiding the truth is exactly what allowed people like Thomas Garrett to operate for so long." He stood and looked around the room at each face in turn. "If you want to remove me from the board, that's your choice. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not. Not anymore." He walked out before anyone could respond. The night before the preliminary hearing, Natalie received an unexpected invitation. Frank's assistant called to say that he would be at his apartment that evening, and he wondered if she might want to come by. Not to discuss the case. Just to talk. She almost said no. For 18 months, she had carefully maintained the distance between them, protecting the independence she had worked so hard to build. But something in his voice, or perhaps something in her own heart, made her accept. Frank's apartment was different from the penthouse she remembered. He had moved to a smaller place in a quieter neighborhood, trading marble floors and panoramic views for hardwood and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street. The space felt lived in, comfortable, unpretentious. He met her at the door and led her to the balcony where two chairs sat facing the evening sky. Plants lined the railing, some she recognized from the penthouse, others clearly new. He had been learning to care for them himself, she realized. The man who once hired people to do everything was now watering his own flowers. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one through the city's haze of light. Finally, Natalie spoke. "Do you know why I left 18 months ago?" Frank nodded slowly. "I think so, but I'd rather hear it from you." She kept her eyes on the sky as she gathered her thoughts. "I left because I realized I was using you to hide from myself. I loved you, I still love you, but I was also running. As long as I was with you, I didn't have to face what was broken inside me. You were so good at taking care of things, so good at making problems disappear. I let myself become one of your projects." Frank absorbed her words without defense. "I was doing the same thing," he admitted. "I thought if I could save you, I could make up for all the years I abandoned you. For all the years I pretended St. Catherine's never existed. I wasn't loving you, I was trying to redeem myself through you." Natalie finally turned to look at him. In the dim light, his face looked older than she remembered, but also softer. The sharp edges that had defined him for so long had worn away. "So where does that leave us now?" she asked. "I don't need you to save me anymore. You don't need me to absolve you?" "What's left?" Frank considered the question carefully before answering. "Maybe what's left is choice. For the first time, we can choose each other without needing something in return. No rescue, no redemption. Just two people who want to be together." The word hung in the air between them, want. Such a simple word, but it carried the weight of everything they had never been able to say. Natalie looked out at the city lights, then back at Frank. I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. Frank reached across the space between their chairs and rested his hand palm up on the armrest, an offering, not a demand. Then we figure it out as we go. No promises we can't keep. No expectations we can't meet. Just one day at a time. Natalie looked at his open hand. She did not take it. But she did not pull away either. The hearing began on a cold November morning. Natalie entered the courthouse through a side entrance flanked by lawyers and advocates who formed a protective barrier against the photographers gathered outside. She wore a simple dark dress and no jewelry. Her hands were steady. Her breath was even. Thomas Garrett sat at the defense table flanked by attorneys in expensive suits. He was 56 years old now, his hair graying at the temples, his face showing the wear of years spent hiding what he had done. He looked like someone's neighbor, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of man you might pass on the street without a second glance. That was what made him so dangerous. That was how he had gotten away with it for so long. When Natalie took the witness stand, she looked directly at him. For 21 years she had avoided even thinking his name. Now she stared into his eyes and felt something unexpected, pity. Not for what he had suffered nothing, but for what he had become. A small, frightened man watching his carefully constructed life crumble around him. The prosecutor began with gentle questions, guiding Natalie through her background, her time at St. Catherine's, her relationship with the staff. She answered clearly, her voice steady. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Then came the harder questions. The storage room, the dates, the details. Natalie told the truth. She did not soften. It did not look away, did not cry. She simply stated what had happened fact after fact until the picture was complete. When she finished, the defense attorney rose for cross-examination. He was a tall man with silver hair and a confident smile that never reached his eyes. Miss Wright, you waited 21 years to come forward with these allegations. Can you explain why? Natalie met his gaze without flinching. I was ashamed. I believed what happened was my fault. It took me 2 decades to understand that the shame belonged to him, not to me. The attorney pressed on, questioning her memory, her credibility, her relationship with Frank Cole. He suggested that she had fabricated her story to gain access to a wealthy man. He implied that her entire testimony was a calculated scheme. Through it all, Natalie remained calm. She answered each question honestly, directly, without rising to his provocations. Finally, the attorney asked his last question. Miss Wright, isn't it true that you have everything to gain from this testimony and nothing to lose? Natalie looked at him for a long moment before responding. I have already lost everything that mattered. My childhood. My innocence. A baby who never had a chance to live. I am not here because I have something to gain. I am here because other children are still being hurt, still being silenced, still being told that their pain doesn't matter. If my testimony can stop even one more child from suffering what I suffered then, it will be worth every moment of this. The courtroom fell silent. Frank testified later that same day. He spoke about St. Catherine's, about the culture of silence that allowed abuse to flourish, about his own complicity in burying the past. He acknowledged his relationship with Natalie publicly and without apology. He accepted that his involvement might complicate the case, but he refused to pretend that he was anything other than what he was, a survivor who had spent too long running from the truth. When the preliminary hearing concluded, the judge ruled that sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. Thomas Garrett would face justice. But for Natalie and Frank, the legal victory was only the beginning. The media coverage intensified in the weeks following the hearing. Natalie's story spread across newspapers and television programs, her face appearing on screens she never watched, her words repeated by voices she never heard. Some people called her brave. Others called her a liar, a gold digger, a woman who had seduced a billionaire and then manufactured trauma to keep him. She stopped reading the comments after the first week. The cruelty of strangers no longer had the power to wound her. She had faced Thomas Garrett in open court. She had spoken the unspeakable. Nothing anyone typed behind a keyboard could compare to that. Frank faced his own consequences. Several major donors withdrew their support from the Glass Ring Foundation, citing concerns about his judgment and the organization's direction. The board voted to accept his resignation as chairman, though they allowed him to remain as a regular member. His company's stock, which he still held in significant quantities, dropped 8% in a single week. He let it all go without protest. The money, the titles, the influence, none of it mattered the way it once had. He was 39 years old, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was and what he valued. Everything else was negotiable. One evening after the worst of the media storm had passed, Frank invited Natalie to dinner at his apartment. Not a romantic dinner, just a meal between two people who had been through something together and needed to decide what came next. They sat at his small kitchen table eating pasta he had cooked himself, drinking wine from glasses that did not match. The domesticity of the scene struck Natalie as almost surreal. 18 months ago, she had served meals in a penthouse that cost more than she would earn in 100 lifetimes. Now she sat across from the same man in a modest apartment, watching him struggle to open a jar of sauce. "I've been thinking," Frank said as they finished eating, "about what happens now. The trial will take months, maybe longer, and after that—" He trailed off, uncertain how to continue. Natalie set down her fork. "After that, we have to decide if this is what we want." Frank nodded. "I know what I want. I want to be with you. Not the way we were before. I don't want to protect you or save you or fix you. I just want to be near you. Wake up next to you. Grow old beside you." He looked down at his hands. "But I also know that what I want doesn't matter if you're not ready. If you need more time, more space, I'll give it to you. I'll wait as long as it takes." Natalie listened to his words, feeling their weight settle into her chest. She had spent so much of her life running from love, convinced that she did not deserve it, that accepting it would mean losing herself. But sitting here in this ordinary kitchen, looking at this ordinary man who had once been extraordinary, she realized something had changed. She was not afraid anymore, but she was not certain either. "I need to think," she said finally. "Not because I don't love you, but because I spent 37 years not knowing who I was. These past 18 months are the first time I've ever felt like a whole person. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to disappear into someone else's life again." Frank reached across the table and took her hand. "You won't. I won't let you. And you won't let yourself." She looked at their intertwined fingers, his hand rough from the copper ring he had made, hers rough from years of work that had never been acknowledged. "Give me time," she whispered. "Just a little more time." Frank brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Take all the time you need." 3 days later, Natalie packed a bag. She told herself it was not running. She told herself she needed space to think, to breathe, to understand what she truly wanted without Frank's presence influencing her decision. She told herself all the reasonable things a reasonable person might tell themselves when they were about to make a choice they could not take back. She wrote him a letter and left it on his kitchen table. The words came slowly, each one extracted from somewhere deep inside her. "I am not leaving because I don't love you. I am leaving because I need to know that I can stand on my own without you beside me. For 18 months, I learned to be alone. Now I need to learn whether being with you is something I choose or something I need, because I'm still afraid of being alone. If I come back, I want it to be because I want to, not because I'm scared of the alternative. Wait for me if you can. But don't put your life on hold. You've done enough waiting. We both have." She signed her name at the bottom, sealed the envelope, and placed it where he would find it. Then she walked out into the gray November morning and caught a taxi to the airport. Frank found the letter that evening. He read it 3 times each reading, bringing a different emotion: sadness, understanding, acceptance. She was doing what she needed to do. He could not fault her for that. He picked up his phone and typed a message. His thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before he pressed it. I understand. I'm not going to chase you. I'm not going to try to change your mind. But I want you to know I'll be here. Not waiting, living. If you ever want to come back, the door is open. If you don't, I'll understand that too. Whatever you decide, know that loving you was the best thing I ever did. And I don't regret a single moment. He set down the phone and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, Natalie was making her way toward an uncertain future. And all he could do was trust that the woman who had survived so much would find her way through this too. Natalie sat in the departure terminal at LaGuardia watching planes lift off into the gray November sky. Her bag rested at her feet. Her boarding pass lay in her hand. The gate agent had already called for boarding twice, and still she had not moved. She thought about the letter she had left for Frank. The words had felt true when she wrote them. She needed to know she could stand alone, needed to prove that choosing him was not the same as needing him. But sitting here now watching strangers file onto a plane that would carry her away from everything she had built in the past 18 months, something felt wrong. She pulled out her phone and read Frank's message again. The words glowed on the screen, simple and honest. He would be there, not waiting, but living. The door would remain open, and he did not regret loving her. Natalie looked at the boarding gate. The final call echoed through the terminal. She asked herself the question she had been avoiding for 3 days. If I was not afraid, would I choose to stay? The answer came immediately, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. Yes, she would stay. She wanted to stay. Not because she needed Frank to complete her, not because she was afraid of being alone, but because she had finally found something worth remaining for. So why was she leaving? The truth settled over her like cold water. She was not leaving because she wanted freedom. She was leaving because running had been her answer to everything for 37 years. When things became difficult, when love became real, when the possibility of happiness pressed too close, she disappeared. It was the only response she had ever known. But she was not that woman anymore. She had faced Thomas Garrett in open court. She had spoken the unspeakable to a room full of strangers. She had learned to look at herself without flinching. Why was she still running from the one person who had never asked her to be anything other than what she was? The gate agent announced the final boarding call. Passengers hurried past her, dragging luggage, clutching coffee cups, rushing toward destinations that mattered to them. Natalie stood up. She did not pick up her bag. She did not walk toward the gate. Instead, she turned and walked the other way through the terminal, past the security checkpoint, out into the November air. The cold hit her face like a wake-up call, sharp and clarifying. For the first time in her life, she was choosing what she wanted instead of what she feared. The taxi ride back to Manhattan took 45 minutes. Natalie spent every moment staring out the window, watching the city scroll past, rehearsing and then abandoning a dozen different versions of what she would say when she arrived. In the end, she decided to say nothing she had not already felt. No prepared speeches. No careful explanations. Just the truth, whatever shape it took when it finally emerged. Frank's apartment building was quiet when she arrived. She climbed the stairs to his floor, her heart pounding in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. When she reached his door, she raised her hand and knocked. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Frank stood in the doorway wearing a faded sweater and jeans, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked at her for a long moment, and then a small smile crossed his face. "You didn't get on the plane." Natalie shook her head. "No, I didn't." He stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was warm, filled with the soft glow of evening light. Plants lined the windowsills, green and thriving. The space smelled like coffee and something cooking on the stove. They stood in the living room, facing each other across a distance that felt both enormous and paper-thin. Natalie spoke first. I don't know what I can promise you. I don't know if I can love you the way you deserve to be loved. I don't know what the future looks like or whether I'll wake up tomorrow wanting to run again." She took a breath. "But I know that I want to try. I want to stay. Not because you need me or because I need you, but because I choose this. I choose you." Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took a step closer. "I don't know what's going to happen either," he said quietly. "I've lived alone long enough to know I can keep doing it. I don't need someone else to make my life complete." He reached out and took her hand. "But I don't want to be alone anymore. I want you here, not to fill some emptiness inside me, but because life with you is better than life without you." Natalie looked down at their joined hands. His fingers were rough, calloused from the copper rings he had made with his own hands. Hers were rough, too marked by years of work that had never been seen or valued. Two hands that had survived different storms, but carried the same scars. "So we try?" she said. Frank nodded. "We try." He released her hand and walked to his bedroom. When he returned, he carried the small wooden box she remembered from 18 months ago. He set it on the table between them and opened the lid. Two copper rings rested on velvet lining. One was worn smooth by time, its surface polished by 20 years of faithful keeping. The other was newer, its craftsmanship imperfect but honest. Frank did not kneel. He did not propose in any traditional sense. He simply looked at her and said, "You told me you would come back for these when you were strong enough. Do you want to take them now?" Natalie looked at the rings for a long moment. Then she reached into the box and lifted the older one, the ring Frank had made when they were children, the ring that had survived everything they had survived. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "This one is mine," she said. Then she picked up the second ring, the one Frank had made, as a grown man, clumsy and imperfect, and placed it in his palm. "That one is yours, to remind you that you've changed too." Frank closed his fingers around the ring and looked at her with something she had never seen in his eyes before: peace. 6 months later, on a quiet morning in May, sunlight streamed through the windows of Frank's apartment. Natalie stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. On the balcony, Frank watered the plants she had brought with her, not to fill an emptiness this time, but because she wanted them there. There had been no wedding, no grand ceremony, no promises made before witnesses. Just two people who had chosen each other day after day without disappearing. Natalie carried the mugs to the balcony and handed one to Frank. They sat in the morning light, shoulders touching, watching the city wake up below them. On her hand, the old copper ring caught the sunlight. On his hand, the new one gleamed imperfect but solid. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some promises are not kept on time, but they are still fulfilled when two people are brave enough to stay and wise enough to love without losing themselves. And that is where their story ends, not with a fairy tale wedding, not with dramatic declarations, but with a quiet morning and 2 cups of coffee. Sometimes that is what a real happy ending looks like, not the moment everyone applauds, but the ordinary days when two people simply choose to stay. Thank you for being here through all 3 parts of Frank and Natalie's journey. Thank you for listening, for caring, for staying with them until the very end. If this story touched something in you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone to find yourself? Have you ever chosen to stay when everything inside you wanted to run? Share your story in the comments. You might be surprised how many people understand exactly what you have been through. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about love, loss, healing, and the courage it takes to be truly known, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I will be back soon with something new. Until then, take care of yourself. And remember, some promises take time. The best ones are worth waiting for.